Chapter 21. Trial. Sabrina could not will her mouth to move or make a sound. Theopen, his robes swaying like curtains about a statue, stepped to Lindsay, who exchanged some words of cult speak with him. Sabrina was unable to absorb what they said. She felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. A sense of vertigo made her dizzy as her mind tried to regain its equilibrium. Theopen will set us free. She could still smell the urine from the old man passed out in the alley beneath those words. They brought the same chill to her now as they did the day Orhem died. She was grateful when Theopen moved away and addressed the crowd. As Sabrina took Lindsay's hand in her own again, her friend turned to her.
"Sabrina, are you all right?"
"Yeah. Fine," she said. She had imagined Theopen a person, a prophet, even a saint, but one long dead, not alive, not a leader. It made the rebellion startlingly real and dangerous. If a word on a wall could become real, what else could? Theopen's robe stopped short of his ankles. His sleeves were wide and drooped to reveal his sinewy arms as he raised his hands to the crowd and asked, "Who speaks for these newcomers?" Now the crowd was hushed. All eyes were on him. A few people stepped forward, calling out, "I speak for Merle." "I speak for Peter."
"I speak for Francis."
And the people on the stage smiled and hugged one another in relief before racing down to embrace those who had spoken for them. This was their way in, Sabrina realized. If someone knew you from one of the circles in the city, you were accepted. Relatives, neighbors, friends, acquaintances came forward to reclaim the other newcomers. 3 people claimed Lindsay. She burst into tears as other raid survivors came forth, running up the stairs to embrace her, their city clothes modified for the desert with scarves and belts holding canteens. Theopen and his assistants looked on, smiling, except for the sour man with the thick glasses and marble eyes. No one spoke for Sabrina. She was on the playground again, standing unpicked, without a friend. Alone. She fought a rising sense of panic, while keeping her face as stony as possible, especially with the more militant-looking men staring at her. With all the joy over the new entrance, it took some time for the crowd to quiet and acknowledge that she alone remained on the stage. Aware of the silence, Lindsay looked up from the crowd and realized what was happening. "Theopen, this is my friend Sabrina. She is a cadet, but she saved me from my fate, breaking me out of prison. I claim her." Theopen frowned. His lips crushed plums on a porcelain plate. "I am afraid a newcomer cannot speak for a fellow newcomer. Our rules are strict. Alas, I did not write them, and I do not claim the power to make an exception. I would lose what authority and trust I have. You understand, Sabrina?" "What is to happen to me?" Sabrina asked. "Visitors who are not known must be kept in confinement for a time," said the man with the marble eyes. The hair on his head was mostly gone, revealing blue veins and a flaking red scalp. White residue was caked in the corners of his mouth. He rubbed his hands as he spoke, making a dry sound like withered husks moving together. He smelled stale and sweaty. Sabrina fought the urge to distance herself. 3 of the armed men, on some invisible signal from Marble Eyes, stepped toward the stairs, their bodies alive with the sound of jingling bullets, creaking leather, bandoliers, and heavy canteens. Lindsay came after them.
"Then I must be too."
A matronly woman who had claimed Lindsay restrained her and said, "Lindsay, don't."
"No!"
Lindsay pulled herself free. She pushed between the men and reached the top of the steps to run across the stage to Sabrina's side. "We came together, and we will stay together. She is my best friend. I trust her, and I claim her," she said, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath.
"She's also a cadet,"
Marble Eyes said.
How do we know her supervisors did not change? How do we know her supervisors did not stage for her to break you out as a perfect opportunity to reach us?
Lindsay paused and moved a braid off her cheek and forehead. It was clear she had never even considered the possibility.
No. She would not do that. She's sacrificed too much.
We cannot be too careful, Marble Eyes said. You both will be placed in the cages.
Cages. Sabrina took one look at the advancing guards and knew what would happen. Despite the kind of sentiments of Theopin and Lindsay's naivete, she knew these men. She may have been wrong about Bran, but she had never encountered someone like him before. As for these men, she had seen their kind at pitchball matches, their faces red with the exertion of screaming, eyes burning with illegal brew, fists clenched with barely repressed violence. She knew them from the alleyways, from the look in Orhem's face as he stabbed Sean, then leapt to his own death. They were the others Grange had spoken of. Fanatics even Lindsay had bemoaned, and Sabrina knew that if she went to the cages, something would happen. Eventually, some accident, and she, and maybe Lindsay, for she could not escape their suspicion either, would not return. Her mind raced. She thought back to her training classes, a lecture on the beliefs of the occultists. You have to know your enemy to defeat your enemy, her instructors had told her. In the event of encounter, capture, or interrogation, officers were to try to manipulate believers. Theories, terminology, beliefs jumbled in her head as she reached for some course of action.
Wait. Let the master decide.
What? Marble Eyes asked, the guards stopping on either side of her and Lindsay.
If I am meant to be here, Sabrina searched for the word, His grace will be with me. If not, then his truth will prevail.
The occult speak was like filth in her mouth, but if it would save them, she would say anything. Lindsay looked bewildered. Grange and the others only less so. Sabrina lifted her chin and projected her best look of religious conviction.
Give me trial by ordeal. And what ordeal would that be?
Marble Eyes said. Sabrina swallowed a lump forming in her throat. Pinpricks of sweat broke out on her forehead.
Combat.
They made her wait in a chamber within the caverns while a ring was sanctified for the contest. The cave walls were covered in niter, and too close. She paced between them, although the constant turning made her dizzy. One of the guards outside had offered her a notebook that was filled with passages from religious texts, copied in a careful, exact hand. It was not unlike the notebook she had taken from the guard she had stunned at the factory. In any other place, she would have been filing it away as evidence. Not here. Here, she had made herself a part of the fantasy and had to play along. She knew she was expected to read the book, and she even flipped through some of the pages, but the passages were nonsense. Instead, she simply clutched it in her hands, the binding bending in her fist. My best attempt at devotion. Lindsay had gone silent since Theopin and the other elders had accepted the match terms. Now she sat outside the chamber, her hands balled under her chin, eyes staring out, unfocused. Sabrina had tried to comfort her, reminding her that Sean had trained her well. She had rarely lost a boxing match in the station gym. Grappling, as Pitt had shown her, would leave her vulnerable. But even a larger opponent here would not have had her training or experience. And if she lost, it would be a cage for her. She was certain of the outcome of that, if less certain wherever it would take place. There would be no one coming from the cities to claim her, no one from the underground circles to vouch for her. Only Lindsay. A few days, a few weeks. Poisoning. A fall. Depending on how long it had been since some of the more militant types had been with a woman, she knew what might come before the accident would be worse than death. But at least Lindsay would be free, and not on one of those terrible farms. In that sense, Sabrina felt a certain serenity. She had redeemed herself in that respect. Lindsay was safe. Lindsay sat up as Grange arrived. The hall was dimly lit by glow bars hung from the ceiling, their polymethylene cylinders bathing the walls in a pink-gold light. Despite the dark, the anger in Grange's face was clear. The guard stood aside and let Grange enter the chamber.
You make a mockery of us, Sabrina. Why?
She felt for the man who had shown her kindness, but she did not waver in her original conviction.
Grange, you know if I go into a cage, I'm not coming out.
He said nothing. He looked over his shoulder at Lindsay, whose expression of naive optimism was heartbreaking. He sighed.
I could station my men.
Sprocket? Denales? Bran? Your men seem far fewer than the muscle out there.
I have others.
I did not see them.
Sabrina, you don't know these people, Lindsay pleaded.
But I do. I know those men. I've seen their kind before. You don't run a rebellion without muscle and authority. I've fought them in the streets, thrown them in cells. I go into those cages. I'm not coming out. That's fine for me. But I won't let that happen to you.
I'll go with you. We'll be safe.
I may have been wrong about Bran, but not these men.
Let me do this, please, Sabrina said. It's the only way you can be safe. And if I win, then, well, it's better for both of us. They will put you against a man, Grange said. A man doesn't scare me.
Sabrina turned to Lindsay, squeezing her shoulder.
Hey, it will be all right.
They say at the gym that I fight like I have 8 arms.
Then it'll be a true ordeal when you face 3 men,
Theopen said, appearing in the passageway beside them, marble eyes trailing behind. She had heard someone in the caverns above refer to him as Dr. Rindle.
3?
Grange said, incredulous.
We have conferred with the elders. A cadet is trained in hand-to-hand combat. 1, even 2 men might not pose a significant challenge,
Theopen said, his hands outstretched as if cradling a fragile bowl between them.
That is preposterous,
Grange said.
The elders prayed on it,
Rindle said, closing his eyes, the lids large and pointed from the magnification of his glasses.
I am an elder. Why was I not consulted?
Grange asked, moving in close to Rindle, his chest expanding with the heat of confrontation. Rindle stepped back behind Theopen, but his voice was still firm.
You brought the visitors in. It was decided that you would not be objective. Theopen, are you going to stand for this?
Grange fumed.
What is done is done. It is in the Master's hands now. I see our combatant has been contemplating his holy words,
Theopen said, looking at the notebook in Sabrina's hands.
But you do not strike me as a believer, cadet.
Maybe if I prevail, I will have reason to. Theopen smiled.
Careful, Cadet Sabria. I've heard too many lies in this life not to recognize one when I hear it. A genuine conversion would be powerful, only after a worthy ordeal. 3 men will ensure that.
Why not 4? Sabrina said, the anger twisting inside, her face turning hot.
Done,
Rindle said, turning, his robes swirling about him as he turned to leave.
That is a true ordeal. I will tell the elders.
Theopen, this is not the community we risked our lives to reach,
Lindsay shouted, pushing herself between the 2 men. Theopen inclined his head towards Lindsay, a hint of coldness in his voice.
But it is a community saving your life right now. Do not presume to understand our ways so soon. You have only just arrived.
As if conscious of his tone, he smiled and touched one of Lindsay's locks, a bell jingling as he did.
What lovely adornments. You are a young woman of vitality and powerful belief. Your faith will see you through this.
He released the lock of her hair and looked to Sabrina.
I believe your friend's faith will see her through this too. I'm not a betting man, but if I were, I think I would bet on our cadet here.
He left. Lindsay covered her face and ran down the passageway. Grange moved to follow her, but Sabrina pulled him back.
Grange, I'm sorry. My temper has always made things worse for me.
Sabrina apologized. Grange looked defeated.
And now worse for her as well. She loves you. And I her. Promise me you will look after her. With all my heart and my faith, the Master as my witness. Thank you. I'll see if I can make things any better with the elders, he said before he left and disappeared into the darkness. They led Sabrina back into the main cavern without her suit. Even though it had no power source, the elders wanted to ensure she had no added advantage. She wore nothing but her running shorts and elastic bra. The air was cold on her skin, and she flexed and slapped her muscles to keep them warm. The cavern had been transformed since their arrival. The space for the match had been marked by oil lamps burning at 6 corners of a ring. The ground bore signs of having been recently swept, and bedrock showed underfoot. The children and teenagers were gone. The divide between the people Grange and Lindsay had described was unmistakable. Compassion, concern, disgust played on the faces of the believers gathered on one side of the ring. Denalis, Bran, and Sprocket stood among them, but even within those sympathetic faces, Sabrina wondered about enemies. How many would like to see a cadet imprisoned, or killed? How committed to peace were they? Sabrina was not ready to wager her life or Lindsay's on it, and it was difficult to read the wall of silent people who crossed their arms or held their hands beneath their chins. On the opposite side stood the soldiers. It was a carnival atmosphere as they cheered their champions and leered at Sabrina, their eyes lingering on her hips and breasts. Along with the cheers, the men would beat their canteens with their knives or hatchets. The clatter was so loud that Sabrina's ears rang. Dag's words, ritualized violence, echoed in her head. For a moment she pictured him kneeling in the discharge channel of the waterworks, his clothes dark with the water and sweat soaking him. Can't think of him now. He betrayed me. 4 men stood apart, shirtless and stretching. Sabrina sized them up as Dr. Rindle moved among them, slapping their flanks like a livestock auctioneer. She felt confident she could handle 1, even 2 at once. But 4? Dr. Rindle made a few substitutions to the fighter lineup, switching out a few men that were too thick around the middle for leaner ones. Denalis protested. This is ridiculous. Let them be chosen at random. He was immediately shouted down by the opposite side. Do you not trust the Master, Brother Denalis? The youngest of the fighters, a blond man with short-cropped hair and a tattooed scalp, cried out. A delighted smile appeared on his face as the men cheered on his challenge. The Master could defeat 100 men, no matter the size! A second fighter, a man with a jagged scar on his cheek, said. The soldiers responded with a chorus of beating knives and canteens. In a brief lull of the noise, someone called out for Sabrina to fight 100 men. The cry was taken up, the soldiers' bloodlust growing, until Theopen called for it to stop. No. But let it be 5. Cheers and boos, but the noise settled down. Sabrina did her best to maintain her resolve. She had learned long ago to wear it like a mask, even when she was withering inside. But she felt the mask slip, and her lips mouth a word of disbelief, betrayal even, when she saw the man who volunteered to be the 5th. Bran. I have a quarrel with the cadet, he announced. She tried to kill me. Theopen sat in a deep-seated chair on the dais, sunk so low into it that the folds of his robes gathered under his arms and around his shoulders in bunches. Speak, brother. Bran explained what had transpired at Willsbury's grave. Even the soldiers were silent. Lindsay tugged at her locks with her clenched fists, while Grange, Denalis, and Sprocket looked at Sabrina and Bran in confusion. Sabrina lowered her head so that her chin touched her chest. Bare, hard stone rested under her feet. By your silence, I am to assume you do not protest, Theopen asked. Only to say it was a misunderstanding. I mistook his intentions. I thought we had made amends on the journey here. Theopen's jaw shifted slightly while he stared at her before waving his hand. 5, then. The Master will show us your true intentions unquestionably.
Grange stepped into the ring and tried to win over the crowd, speaking of love, compassion, and the true will of the master. Sabrina could see he had the support of many of the believers, the civilians, but they were neither as loud nor as intimidating, even if they were larger in number. Theopen allowed Grange to continue until the soldiers shouted him down and his voice was lost amongst the clamor. The match would take place. It had a life of its own now. Another elder, an old man whose robe seemed too big for his thin, hunched frame, entered the ring. In shaking, liver-spotted hands, he lifted a calabash of oil above his head, and the conversations and cheers broke off. Sabrina stared at it, mainly because she knew that if her eyes met Lindsay's, she would weep. Now was a time for steeliness. Her gaze drifted to the ceiling, where a tangle of wires and cables snaked between mismatched lights, the twisted looping lines, their lengths hung with dust, brought to mind the entrails of some beast, flung to the heavens in some obscene gesture to bloodthirsty gods. Here, in the belly of the beast. The elder prayed for the truth to emerge from the trial of combat. Most of his words were impossible to hear, as he mumbled into his hands folded about the calabash. When he was finished, he moved over to the fighters and anointed them. Blondie and Scar were first. Blondie's body was packed with muscle. His arms would give him a long reach in the ring, but Sabrina counted on him being inexperienced. Scar was older, as were the other two, one man whose torso was thick as a tree trunk, and another who only had one eye. What they lost in speed, they would make up for in cunning. The older men were all heftier. Their bulk would work against her, their bodies absorbing her blows like a finger flicking a horse. Then there was Bran. When she looked at him, she felt as if she had been punched in the belly. She marveled at how wrong she could have been about him, and whatever friendship they had developed. But self-doubt was self-defeating. She shook her head and stretched out her arms and legs. She had never won a fight by force, against a man anyway. Sean had coached her long ago that her strategy had to be to outlast her male opponents. They would underestimate her, and when the fight would last longer than the men had anticipated, they would grow tired. Fatigue, frustration, and wounded pride would work against them as much as punches. They would make a mistake. Then she would strike. But 5 men. 5 would wear her down. Grappling would be a lost cause. She could not remain engaged with any one fighter for more than 2 strikes, at best, and with one of those 2 strikes likely being a feint or a block. Each one had to count. Quick, precise. She would have to be effective immediately, because her own fatigue would take its toll on her before them. With shirts removed, tattoos of moons and suns orbited the torsos of her opponents, while inked sword hilts hung above their navels, the blades sinking downward into their pants. Gone were the pieties of the welcome ceremony. This was a transformed place. Theopen seemed to be presiding over something wholly different now. The elder anointed each fighter 3 times, tracing a sun, a moon, and a sword over their head, hearts, and shoulders respectively. A few men, including Bran, offered their fists to be anointed with the sword as well. Finished, the elder was disappearing beyond the smoking oil lamps into the crowd when Sabrina had an idea and asked to be anointed as well. "I have not given up on you yet, Lindsay." The elder kept at bay, his hands clasped around the calabash, his eyes searching Grange, Dr. Rindle, then Theopen. With another flick of the wrist, Theopen signaled for the elder to comply, saying, "If it is to be a sanctified match, let her be anointed as well." The elder approached, hesitantly mumbling some cult speech about the way of the moon bringing wisdom, the sun bringing holy fire, and the sword righteousness. As he reached for her shoulder, Sabrina swept the calabash from his hands and shoved him backwards. He was light and frail and tumbled over, tripping on his robe. If only her opponents would be so easily bested. Before he could recover, she removed the stopper and poured the oil out onto her shoulders, breasts, back, and legs, tossing aside the empty vessel and spreading the slippery liquid all over her body. Occultists cried out, red-faced, protesting her blasphemy, but Theopen silenced them. "She desires his grace. Be that he is as generous with her as the oil she spills. Now,
Start the match.
The elder hastened to make a quick retreat while Sabrina's opponents stalked into the ring, Blondie, Scar, and Tree Trunk leading the way, Bran and One Eye bringing up the rear. Her hope that it would be a tag-in match with her facing one at a time evaporated. It would be a brawl, just as she expected. With so many opponents, she realized that in close quarters, they would get in one another's way. At best, she might be fighting 3 at a time, but that was still too many. She knew what she needed. They had to be scattered. She danced around the ring, moving just out of their reach. They were being cautious, testing her reflexes and speed with feints and half-hearted swings. Blondie was proving impulsive, coming in close more often than the others. Scar and Tree Trunk waited eagerly behind him, spoiling for a fight, while One Eye and Bran hung back, studying her. Those two will be dangerous. The crowd was becoming impatient. One spectator shoved her back into the ring when she danced close to the edge to avoid one of Blondie's strikes. She nearly tripped over one of the oil lamps. Stumbling, she distanced herself from the flames, lest the oil doused on her ignite. She struggled to remain patient, waiting for a formation to her liking. With a duck and a feint, she dodged one of Tree Trunk's attempts to grab her around the waist. The men now spread out in a row across the ring: Scar, Blondie, Tree Trunk, Bran, One Eye. It was time. She attacked not the center, but the flank, choosing Blondie as her target. She closed the distance, leapt, and landed with both feet on his chest. He was solid, but not as thick as the others. His inexperience had not prepared him for such an assault. As he fell backwards, he tried to grab her, but she kicked one oily ankle free, then smashed his face with the heel of her boot. He let out a sickening, whistling wheeze, and a warm spray of spit and blood spattered on her bare leg. Scar was separated now from the pack, and she caught him with a heel of her palm under his nose, hoping to break it, but if nothing else, momentarily blind him with tears and blood. She pirouetted and kicked backwards, aware that Tree Trunk was just behind her. She struck him in the abdomen, but his size and momentum sent her tripping forward. She turned as he closed in, arms outstretched. It was easy to stop him with a kick to the groin, and as he bent over, she broke his collarbone with a right hammer strike, feeling the slender bone pop beneath her fist, and noting with satisfaction how the two pieces moved out of alignment as he fell to his knees. She threw a punch at his nose for good measure, but he turned his head so she struck his ear. It was one strike too many. One Eye slammed into her, tackling her to the ground, pinning her with his weight and raining blows down on her face. Lights flashed in her vision. Geometric shapes and colors appeared even behind closed eyes as her skull rang with a high-pitched buzzing that drowned out everything else. She tasted blood. This was the end. There was no escaping from this position. Her moments of ascendancy were past, the inevitable advantage of numbers settling down on her with all the weight of the man atop her. As she resigned herself to defeat, a certain peace settled over her. A peace she knew she had been seeking all along. She had arrested her own friend, placed her in danger, and for that, she deserved what was coming. She knew she had lost Lindsay long ago to these people, and the best she could do to right the wrongs, to give Lindsay a second chance, was to simply give up and hope one of the blows would be fatal. But two strong hands pulled her out from under One Eye, roughly yanking her by the armpits. It was Bran. He had not had an opportunity to contribute his measure of suffering upon her yet. He pinched her arms painfully behind her back and swung her out limply, helplessly to the others. A string of her blood leaked down to the floor from her lips. She could not even muster the breath to spit. The crowd of soldiers was a wall of shaking fists, open mouths, red, wet holes of darkness waiting to devour her. So it was to last that much longer. Bran would see to that. Tree Trunk was off to the side, holding his collarbone. Blondie was on all fours, wheezing, mucus and blood strung from his face to the floor. But Scar had wiped the blood from his eyes, spreading it over his face, a bloody red mask. One Eye was getting up, panting from the exertions of beating her, his knuckles red with their blood. The sword tattoo rising from his groin like some hideous deformed phallus. He was closer and reached her before Scar, backhanding her across the face, turning to his side of the crowd for their approval, which they returned in a unified voice that boomed off the cavern walls. Sabrina wanted to look for Lindsay, but her vision was filled with the sight of the man before her, and her head was spinning out of control. She wanted this to be over. That would be less painful on her friend. If she could just hear her voice once more and take that with her. She tried to listen for Lindsay, but instead heard Bran's voice speaking into her ear, his breath warm on her skin.
"Come on, girl, fight! You've got it in you!"
He was taunting her, humiliating her. He was so close his pelvis was up against her, perhaps threatening her with worse violations that were to come. He ground his pelvic bone into her backside, moving her in a way that made some of the closer onlookers hoot with laughter. His mouth was close to her ear again.
"I've got your back."
One Eye was turning to her again for a second slap, just as something surged through her. Some understanding that she still had a chance, that she and Lindsay, their friendship, had life in it still. She slipped her arm easily out of Bran's loosened grip, wrapped it around his shoulder, and shifted her foot. His body was close to her. Too close. It took little effort for her to bend at the waist, ram her hip into him, and shift his center of gravity. She flung him over her shoulder into One Eye, their bodies colliding with a loud meat-on-meat slap. They both tumbled, Bran landing atop One Eye, giving her time. Tree Trunk backed out of the ring, his arms useless. He was out. Blondie was recovering slowly, but a kick to his face sent him reeling and silenced the crowd. She turned to Scar, her limbs trembling. He had learned his lesson and was keeping his distance. She had him one-on-one, while One Eye was trying to extricate himself from beneath Bran, who was moving slowly, holding his shoulder as if injured. Sabrina did not want her advantage to slip away, but Scar was proving to be cagey, moving and dodging her, stalling until the others could join him, and he could press the advantage of numbers. She moved in close, distracting him with blows to the face before she swept his legs out from beneath him. He did not go down easily, grabbing her by her shorts as he fell. She lost her footing and crashed down beside him, his hand twisting the material around her waist and pulling her toward him. One of the oil lamps was burning just beside her. She grabbed its neck and swung it into his face. The clay shattered and the oil blazed. She rolled away to avoid catching fire herself. Scar slapped at his face before spectators intervened, throwing a cloak over his face and putting out the flames. His beard was singed and smoking, his eyes full of fury. Sabrina charged and worked her feet up for a jump, but he had seen this trick and dodged left. She anticipated it, sidestepped, skidded, and threw herself onto the earthen floor. She spun one knee and extended the opposite leg, striking him in the back of his knee, buckling the leg. When he fell, she was upon him like a wild animal, taking his hand and twisting the palm while straddling his prone body. His arm pressed against her groin, and she used her legs to twist until the arm jerked out of its shoulder socket, the crowd gasping in unison at the popping noise. One Eye plowed into her from behind, lifting her and carrying her towards the stage where Theopen sat watching, motionless, but for his eyes darting between his narrowed lids. The crowd was thinnest here, and cleared immediately, leaving nothing but the timber of the stage. A woman screamed as Sabrina collided with it, then she realized that the stranger's cry was her own. The air was quickly gone from her lungs as One Eye slammed her into the wood repeatedly. She was in the classroom, Pitt throwing her against a desk all over again. But the effort was costing her opponent. He stepped back for another run into her, pausing to catch his breath, trying to hold her in place with one arm. She writhed against his strength. The oil helped. He strained to keep her in place, the tendons rising in his neck, but she freed one arm, then the other, and thrust her thumb into his eye socket. Muscle and sinew and skin fought her as she pressed, and he squinted, but her fingers would win. Her thumbnail was already sinking into his left eyeball. He dropped her and fell back. She had to catch her breath before she kicked him in the pommel of his sword tattoo, where his lowest ribs met. He doubled over and she snatched one of his hands as he did so, twisting it and him into the floor where she raked his face with her nails.
Please, not my eye! I yield!
She released him, but then her right leg exploded with pain. Her knee buckled and she hit her head on the bedrock floor. The room spun. She wondered if a sixth fighter had joined. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a shock of blonde hair.
Blondie.
She tried to scramble up, but it was more of a stumble, the leg he struck refusing to move the way she wanted. She was seeing double. Blondie's face was red and misshapen. She had knocked out one of his teeth. He had ripped off a piece of the stage, a wooden plank that he swung like a club. Spectators booed and protested. Even some of the soldiers seemed to disapprove. Sabrina looked to Theopen to intervene, but he watched without expression. Sabrina continued to pedal backwards, trying to shake the pain out of her leg and blink away her double vision. She did her best to avoid Bran as well, who she could tell was trying to formulate some response to help her without exposing their alliance. No time. Blondie charged in again, swinging the board at her head. She ducked, nearly tumbling over as she shifted her weight to her injured leg. Blondie overextended, the board going wide and nearly striking a spectator. He righted himself, but the crowd had turned against him. His near victim began to quarrel with him. Blondie turned his back on Sabrina. She took advantage of the opening, limping up behind him and snatching the board from his hand as he reared back with it, intimidating one of the believers. His eyes registered surprise the instant before she broke the board across his face. As he fell, she could see civilians, even a few soldiers cheering for her, their eyes wide, their hands balled into fists. For an instant, she was transported back to Carnap Avenue, rosemary and aniseed scenting the air lit gold by the setting sun. Sean stood before her smiling, while a gaggle of boys ran after a pitch ball, and their mothers clapped for Sabrina, her cheeks suddenly flush with heat, her armpits itching with moisture.
I can't be responsible for all their hopes and dreams.
But you are.
The cheers lessened. Bran was upon her now, tackling and wrestling her to the ground. She screamed as his weight fell on her injured leg, a knot of pain exploding above her knee and shooting up her thigh. She pulled free and stood her ground. Bran charged again, but he made it easy. He stumbled and swung wide. Sabrina encircled his waist, carried his arm over his shoulder, and flung him down to the ground. Stars streaked across her vision, a curtain of darkness descending on the periphery. She knew she would never have completed this maneuver if he had not been a willing victim. With his arm locked, she flipped him on his side, collapsed to her knees, then all the way to her shoulder and wrapped his neck in her thighs. It was difficult to hold him there, as slippery as she was with sweat and oil and her muscles burning and shaking with exhaustion. But he only made a token effort to resist, convincing enough of those watching before she squeezed. His face turned a deep maroon, and his whiskers tickled her skin. She was not sure if he tapped out before he lost consciousness, but abruptly he stiffened, and just as quickly went limp and motionless between her legs. She released him and lay there for what felt like a long while, staring up at the mess of electronics and lighting on the cavern ceiling. Gradually, her breathing slowed, and Bran stirred next to her. She became aware of Lindsay's face looking down at her, wearing an expression of relief mixed with awe, and the unmistakable flush of victory. A smile appeared amid the tears, and Sabrina felt herself laugh, her fear vanishing. Meanwhile, a towering figure stood over them, hands out to his side, facing down a number of shouting men.
She won fair, boys,
Denalis said, his fingers spreading wide before he curled them into fists the size of demolition hammers. The angry losers were soon crowded out by the onlookers who had been against the spectacle in the first place. Kind-faced men and women moved in around them, forming a protective circle. In stature, they were all smaller than the fierce men, but there was a firm resolution in their eyes, a cold determination of their own. Theopen rose from his chair.
Enough. We have our answer. Providence is on her side. We will accept her with full rights of any other member.
It was nothing like a fight now. Theopen stood tall, commanding, solemn. He made a sign over his body that others copied. Still others kneeled and prayed while they made the same gesture over their bodies. Theopen was speaking up to the ceiling, his eyes closed. Denalis picked up Sabrina, his hand gently smoothing her hair, while Grange and Sprocket attended to Bran.
Did I hear Theopen say we just witnessed a miracle?
Sabrina asked Denalis, her head against his chest, her words thick around her bruised and bloody lips.
Aye, and I think we did,
Denalis said, smiling.
It would take nothing short of a miracle to get Bran's ugly face between your thighs.